All right, I think most of us are here now, so I'll get started. We had one brag for this week, and that comes from Oliver Lasnik, Natasha Maruch, Shan Kamal, Spencer Lowe, and Fumika Holt, who had their abstract accepted to the Neural Match conference this December for a flash talk. So congrats, Oliver and team, and I'll be introducing Kelly. Mahaffy is a first-year graduate student in developmental psychology at the University of Connecticut, where she works with Nicole Landy. Her primary research interests include the neurobiology of fluent and disfluent reading comprehension and individual differences in comprehension ability. Kelly uses neuroimaging methods like MRI and EEG to address these questions and particularly enjoys conducting neuroimaging with children. Before starting graduate school in psychology, Kelly spent time as a K-12 teacher and completed a master's degree in English with a focus on cognitive literacy theory. So go ahead and take it away, Kelly.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen, and while I do that, I just dropped 2 links in the chat that might be helpful to you. So today I'm going to run through the kind of very first steps and preliminary results of my master's project, which is titled Are All RD Brains the Same? Gray and White Matter Structure in Specific Reading Comprehension Deficit, Developmental Dyslexia, and Typically Developing Controls. As you might have seen from the abstract, despite the title of this presentation, we won't go too far into the brain details today. Sorry about that. But I want to kind of share some early steps and some steps that I think are really important to address before we get to the brain-related kind of portion of this project. The 2 links that I dropped in the chat might be useful to you. The one with the SLAC BB will bring you to the slides, and most of them have speaker notes if that would be helpful. The other one will bring you to the OSF repository for this project. The pre-registration is currently still embargoed, but there is the full data set and the project proposal available in that. And that is a private link for now, so just please don't share the link outside of our community, but that is there if that would be helpful to you. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump in. So many of us likely recognize the importance of reading in our daily lives. Fluent reading ability is vital to both academic and personal success, yet you might be surprised by the number of people that struggle to acquire fluent reading ability, and by the fact that these struggles seem to really cut through many of the social structures that we are interested in, like race, ethnicity, SES, and environment. So on the screen, you'll see an image that's very famous in the reading literature by Dr. Hollis Scarborough. What we know about reading is that it's a complex skill and one that we're not evolved to perform. There simply hasn't been enough time between the advent of written word and now for evolution to kind of drive this ability. So instead, we think that this is a kind of combinatorial practice. And in this image, you'll see some of the kind of key skills that Scarborough and others thought were important for developing skilled reading. Note that these things include things we might typically consider reading subskills, such as phonological awareness, decoding, and spelling. But they also involve some higher order skills, things like background knowledge, vocabulary, literacy, reasoning. All of these must combine, in her view, to kind of develop the ability to read what we call fluently, or with a kind of skilled reading approach. So what happens when these things don't combine correctly, or when there's some kind of issue in the process of combining all of these abilities? In many ways, that's where the idea of reading disability comes in. So for many of us, reading disability is likely synonymous with dyslexia. I'll be using the term slightly differently as the field is kind of moving away from this definition. So instead of thinking just about dyslexia when I say reading disability, I'm thinking of reading disability as an umbrella term that really encompasses the diverse difficulties and disorders which may impact any of these levels or skills that Scarborough was thinking of. So for example, you might think of a child with a very typical case of dyslexia having a deficit in decoding and/or phonological awareness, But a reading disability might also impact something like background knowledge or vocabulary, and those can all be kind of meaningfully combined with this umbrella term of reading disabilities. With that being said, dyslexia is probably the reading disability that most people are the most familiar with. Of course, I can't cover the vast dyslexia literature even in this hour, much less in a single slide. I can't even cover the work that our community does on dyslexia in that time. So I thought I would highlight a few of what I consider the most important and most exciting findings about dyslexia. First, dyslexia is estimated to affect about 9% of the population, though some recent estimates from the International Dyslexia Association actually put that closer to 15 to 20%. There are primary deficits that are often implicated in dyslexia, particularly decoding and phonological awareness, but we also often see deficits in things like rapid naming. Interestingly, and kind of importantly for my sample, which you'll see in a minute, the term dyslexia as a diagnosis really functionally means nothing. So we see dyslexia diagnosed quite readily, especially in the school system, because in many states, it's the only way to get a child with any reading disability services. So when we see dyslexia, we might see a wide range of symptoms or of kind of deficits. Whereas for clinical purposes, we think of decoding and phonological awareness as kind of keys to dyslexia. So just to kind of separate that, I'm thinking of the very clinical decoding-based version of dyslexia for this project. Of course, one hallmark of dyslexia is its high rate of comorbidity with ADHD. And finally, with regards to brain structure and function, we typically see decreased activation and decreased gray matter volume in the canonical left hemisphere reading network in those with dyslexia. So think of regions like the left inferior frontal gyrus, inferior middle and superior temporal gyri, the parietal lobe, the areas that we see implicated in your kind of typical reading network. Those are the areas in which we often see decreased activation or decreased gray matter. There's also been a lot of work done on white matter structure in developmental dyslexia in particular, and with a particular focus on the arcuate fasciculus. A few really interesting and cool papers have come out recently. One shows that structural differences in the arcuate fasciculus exist from very early childhood and actually can go on to predict if a child is diagnosed with dyslexia. Another from our own lab has shown that even the microstructure of white matter, in this case, neurite density and dispersion, are altered in those with dyslexia as opposed to typical controls. So we know a lot about dyslexia, but it is definitely the reading disability which is the best characterized in the current literature, in my opinion. So what about a reading disability that is not so well characterized? This is where specific reading comprehension deficit comes in. So you'll see that it has an estimated prevalence that's about the same as dyslexia, about 10% of the population. However, I would argue that it's understudied as compared. Generally, specific reading comprehension deficit is characterized by showing poor reading comprehension despite possessing average word level decoding. There have only been a few imaging studies of SRCD, but we typically see an atypical brain function within and outside of the canonical reading network. So unlike dyslexia, where we really see the kind of bulk of the differences in brain in the left hemisphere, in specific reading comprehension deficit, we see much more bilateral kind of differences as opposed to both readers with dyslexia and typical readers. There have been a few papers exploring specific aspects of these brain differences. One showed that there was atypical functional connectivity between the left inferior frontal and the hippocampus. Another showed decreased gray matter volume in right frontal regions as compared to dyslexia and to typical controls. But the literature of this is very small. So there's a single paper on gray matter, a single paper on functional connectivity, and a few functional MRI studies. And that's really it. There have been no studies of white matter at all. And that's really where my project comes in. So I'll present you a quick kind of roadmap to the project at large, and then I'll jump into where I'm at currently. So first, I want to look at ways that we commonly classify those who have specific comprehension deficits and decide on a group to use for future analyses. As the abstract alluded to, this will really be kind of the focus of the talk for today. After we decide on which group makes the most sense to kind of use going forward, we will age, sex, IQ, and ADHD diagnosis match dyslexia and control groups. We then have a few whole brain gray matter analyses, a few whole brain white matter analyses, and if those white matter analyses show results that we feel are promising, then we do plan to do a NODI analysis as well, which would look at that white matter microstructure, which was shown to be altered in readers with dyslexia. So from here, I'm going to jump into some of the details of my project. I'll just stress that I would absolutely love any feedback that you have, and to please jump in at any time with questions, comments. If this turns into a discussion, that would be great on my end. So definitely feel free to jump in or interrupt at any point. Okay. So I want to start by telling you a little bit about the sample, because this sample is really special, and it's one of the reasons that we can conduct an analysis like that, like the one that we have planned. So the data set that I'm using is the Child Mind Institute's Healthy Brain Network data. There are three kind of main tenets of this data set that are important. First, the data set is extremely large, particularly given the age of its participants. So all participants in this data set are adolescents. They range in age from 4 to 18. Before screening out any participants, the data set currently sits at about 2,500. After screening out our participants, which I'll give you the methods for in just a few slides, our total sample includes right at 1,500 children. This data set is particularly well characterized. So it is one of the absolute largest data sets I've ever seen. We have measures on things like reading and language, of course. We also have measures on parent report of birth history, family situation, things like SES, the language environment, who exactly a child lives with, and their relationship with each of those people. We have a very detailed questionnaire about the parent-child relationship from both the parent's perspective and the child's. And perhaps most importantly, we have a lot of information about diagnoses. Lastly, the sample is extremely diverse. It's particularly diverse in consideration of the kinds of samples that we often get coming into the lab, especially here in Connecticut. Most of the participants in this sample are recruited from the New York City area. However, that's not a requirement to participate. So it's just kind of where most of the people come from. So to give you a glimpse of the diversity of this sample, I'm pulling from a project that a colleague of mine, Martina Villa, did. And on the screen, first, you'll see just the kind of diversity that I think many of us jump to immediately, which is racial and ethnic diversity. You'll see that the kind of largest proportion of our sample is white or Caucasian, but we do have more racial diversity than is typical in a lab sample for sure. And we have a kind of decent proportion of ethnic diversity as well. Thinking of other kinds of diversity, you see on the screen now an SES breakdown. This breakdown was also done by race, but you can see that there is a pretty good amount of diversity in the kind of SES background of families. All of the scales for these are in the top, but you'll see that unlike many of the lab samples that we have, particularly education and occupation, are quite middle ground for most of our participants, instead of being at the kind of higher levels of family education, such as when a participant comes in that has a parent who's a professor or something similar. lastly, just something that I am trying to keep in mind and kind of an important note, I think, when you're working with a large sample. So Martina did her project kind of considering diversity and imaging metrics in general. And we did find significant relationships between race and one of our metrics that we use to measure the quality of MRI scans. So when we process an MRI scan, we use a quality control algorithm, which computes some kind of values that we can use to try to understand the quality of the data. Most labs threshold these. So you kind of pick your threshold and say if it's above this, then it is an image that is of good enough quality that we can use it in an analysis. And if it's below, then we will automatically kind of screen it out. That's exactly what we do for the CMI data set. And we did find a significant effect of CNR, contrast to noise ratio, for race in the imaging. So basically what this means is that a participant's race predicted if they had the values that were kind of at or above threshold or below. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind. There were many other imaging metrics that we tested, and this was the only one that was significant, which in some ways is very promising, but it's something that I'm really trying to keep in the front of my mind as I approach the brain-related analyses on this project. So I definitely love to hear feedback from you all if you have any on how to deal with things like this other than just controlling for race. Okay, so to jump in a little bit more to our project at hand, I want to start by looking at some of the general inclusion criteria that we used. So as a reminder, a few slides ago, I showed you that kind of project map. Our goal is to have 3 groups: a specific reading comprehension deficit group, a dyslexia group, and a control group, and to compare those groups not only behaviorally, but also to compare their brain structure. For this, we decided that our inclusion criteria should include an IQ cutoff. So we used nonverbal IQ scores of 75 or above. We wanted all of our participants to have available an IQ score, our reading comprehension score, the Tower scores that we are using as our word reading scores, and either a diffusion weighted image or a T1 weighted MRI image that has passed quality control standards. Most of our participants have both diffusion and T1 weighted images available. This really kind of comes down to if you are, comfortable in the scanner and doing well, you probably do well for both of these images. It does happen that children might have just one or another. Things like bathroom breaks happen, and so sometimes kids get a little bit antsy, especially during the end of a scanning sequence. However, the majority of our sample does have either both of these images or neither of them. And finally, perhaps the biggest question, we wanted to exclude for diagnoses that we thought might impact the results. But what in the world are those diagnoses, and how do you decide which diagnoses are, potentially important to something like reading and which are not? So this is one of the areas that I'm most interested in feedback. And I'll just show you kind of what we excluded, what we included, and some general numbers on those. So we tried to exclude things that we felt would directly impact reading or language abilities. We had good evidence would impact brain structure, or that we felt like might impact something kind of along the way to reading, such as vision or sensory processing. So on the left, you'll see the diagnoses we exclude. We exclude things like autism, pervasive developmental delay, not on the spectrum, developmental delay, Fragile X, selective mutism, etc. The numbers that you see are the numbers of participants that were excluded as having that diagnosis. And these were done in this order. So some of these children would have had multiple diagnoses, but they were screened in this order. The diagnoses that we include, on the other hand, are things like learning disorders. This is often how parents kind of put dyslexia into our database, because dyslexia was not an option, because we know that it clinically has a very different meaning than what it might at school. So we asked parents to classify what they might have gotten at school as a dyslexia diagnosis, as a learning disorder with a specialty in reading. We included children with ADHD. We did decide to include social disorders such as anxiety, depression, oppositional defiant, and PTSD. And we included a small set of other kind of disorders or diagnoses, including obsessive compulsive, bedwetting, other things like this. It's important to know that our participants were not excluded if they had multiple diagnoses. For example, many of our participants had either a learning disorder and ADHD or a social disorder and ADHD. And this ended up with 516 of our total participants that were included having a diagnosis. So this is about a third of our sample. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in with first thoughts, or I can keep going, whatever is best. All right, I will keep going. So I want to focus today on the classification models that we use and why I feel like this is in many ways a really high stakes decision for moving forward with this project. So we have now our kind of inclusion criteria and we have our diagnoses. I wanted to look at the variables that we were hoping to use in our modeling for our classifications because we have a limited number of variables. We needed a vocabulary measure, and the only vocabulary measure that we have in this sample is from WISC, which is what we're using for our nonverbal IQ. So it's important to know that nonverbal IQ, of course, doesn't include the vocabulary measure, but there was some concern over whether those two scores would be highly correlated because they come from the same general test. So we just kind of ran a very quick PCA as a sanity check to be sure that things were kind of clustering as we expected. And as expected, we see a large cluster of our kind of reading and language measures. We see diagnosis and we see IQ split fairly well from our reading measures. So next, we got into the two most common ways that we classify participants as specific reading comprehension deficit. You may have heard of this diagnosis before, probably not. This is not a diagnosis that kids like typically get from school or from even a doctor. This is not a diagnosis that we kind of trade in the same way as we give dyslexia diagnoses. And so this is something we really only classify in samples that we are looking at for research. And there are a few ways that labs have commonly done this in the past. The first is the deficit model. The second is the regression model. So in a deficit model, you kind of very strictly classify based on only a few measures. So it really goes back to that definition of specific comprehension deficit as being lower than expected comprehension based on decoding. What this typically looks like is classifying children with reading comprehension standard scores of less than or equal to 90 and word reading scores, standard scores of greater than or equal to 100 as having specific reading comprehension deficit. So for this classification model, it's basically just these two checkboxes. Is your reading comprehension score 90 or less? Is your word reading score 100 or more? If yes to both things, you'll be considered specific reading comprehension deficit grouped. The second is a regression model. This has become much more common in the past 5 years and really was championed by Nicole and Kaylee of my lab, as well as some others kind of in the comprehension world. But this model looks for cases in which reading comprehension ability is not well described or well predicted by reading subskills. So you'll see on the screen the kind of regression model that we typically use. It's one in which reading comprehension scores are predicted by word reading ability, vocabulary, nonverbal IQ, age, diagnosis, and the interactions between all of those variables. And the idea is that no matter how you're reading in a kind of standard score, if those reading subskills don't predict your comprehension, then in theory, something might not be working as efficiently as it could. So the way that we typically do this is to run the regression model, to plot the residuals, and those with residuals of less than 0 are those who have a difference in what was expected versus the actual comprehension score. So to show you the kind of results of these two models quickly, the deficit model is seen here. As a reminder, this uses the reading comprehension scaled scores, which are on the x-axis, and the Tower sight word efficiency standard scores as the word reading scores. For those of you unfamiliar, Tower is a timed word reading test. So participants see long lists of words and have 45 seconds to read as many of them as they can. The words start out fairly easy, but they get harder as you go along. So things like is, up, cat, red, me, to, no, we are the start of the list, and they get to much longer and more complex words. And you standardize this by looking at how many words a participant read correctly within the 45 seconds, or if you are an adult and a particularly good reader and finished before 45 seconds, how long it took you to read all of the words that you read correctly. With this grouping, we had 55 participants in our SRCD group. The mean age of these participants was 10 and a half, and you see their mean sight word efficiency scores and reading comprehension scores. So our sight word efficiency is slightly above average at 108.9, and our reading comprehension is about 1 standard deviation below average at 85. Next, the regression model. And I will warn you, I struggled a lot with the code on the regression model, and I would definitely be interested in thinking about if there's a better way to do this. So what I have graphed here is the residuals. As a reminder, the residual is the difference between the expected and the actual comprehension score based on those subskills. So what you're seeing is the kind of difference between what we expect given the subskills, the reading subskills that we used in the model, and what we got. The model is the reading comprehension predicted by, we used phonemic decoding efficiency in this model just because it tends to not cluster quite as tightly with reading comprehension. This test also comes out of Tower, but instead of sight words, it's pseudo words. So you have words like ip, ga, ko, ta, pronounceable non-words, and you standardize in the same way. Our model also included vocabulary, diagnosis, IQ, and the interactions between those. You'll see that the numbers are very different here. So we had 712 children classified as SRCD in this model. The mean age is slightly lower at 9.7. Our mean phonemic decoding efficiency score is slightly lower than our sight word efficiency score was. And our reading comprehension score is almost 10 full points higher than our reading comprehension score was in the old classification model. To put these side by side in a way that might make a little bit more sense to you, we have the reading comprehension and Tower scores mapped here. I did map the regression model children with the sight word reading scores, just so that we had the same exact things on both axes to see the relationships. With a regression model, we would expect a kind of more variance, a kind of larger scale for our variables of interest, just because we're not limiting it to such strict criteria. But this is perhaps larger than I expected. And so I'm curious to hear from you all about feedback on this and some ongoing questions. One of my biggest ongoing questions is there a way to evaluate classification schemes, right? Is there some hallmark of best fit when you're thinking of grouping outside of the means of, the reading comprehension or your outcome variable? Other things that we were interested in thinking about are what diagnoses might be influential for reading ability. Is there something that we should be including that we're currently excluding, should be excluding that we're currently including? If our inclusion criteria seem fair, and what other analyses seem interesting. And that's all that I have for today. So I would love any feedback that you have or any questions or comments.
Thank you, Kelly. We'll get started with any students that have questions. Rebecca. Oh, wait, no, you're just clapping. My bad. I believe I see Emma has a question.
Hey, Kelly, it's me, Kaya, actually, as you know, but nice presentation, very clear. I love it. I have two questions. The first is just based on the slide just before this, where you're looking at the regression model that you guys did. So I understand that the residual thing is looking at the difference between what you'd expect reading comprehension to be based on their decoding skills. But it seems like counterintuitive to me to say that a kid who's scoring like a 120 on reading comprehension is having problems with reading comprehension. So like, what do you make of that is my first question.
Yeah, same. This was much more widespread than I anticipated it to be. And I think that in my head, I can kind of understand, if you're scoring a 120 on reading comprehension, but a 180 on word reading, maybe you are really something's not quite matching up. But I wonder too how much of this could be driven by single tests and by the tests that we particularly are using. So Tower is a timed test. As someone who administers Tower a lot, some kids get really into it and like really, really love Tower and like work so hard for 45 seconds. Other kids think it's dumb and hate that it's timed. And if you tell them that, they'll not read anything. And so I don't know how to potentially control for those kinds of differences. I don't really have a conceptual problem with including someone with a high reading comprehension score in the model as someone with specific comprehension deficit, but I understand your point, and I think I have similar kind of concerns about, are we getting at potentially different questions here with those who are really struggling to comprehend anything versus those who are struggling to comprehend things that might be, slightly over their age range or something like that.
Thanks, that helps with the two different questions thing, I think. And then my other question, sorry, is does this group that you're talking about, the SRCD group, overlap entirely with like a specific language impairment group? Or yeah, that's one question, I guess.
Yeah, it does not. So if you are at all familiar with the history of the SRCD literature, which I am only slightly, but one of the reasons that this is not diagnosed very commonly in schools, if ever, one of the reasons that I think it has not seen a lot of interest in research is that the big debate for forever in this field has been, is SRCD a thing or is it just DLD and it just manifests in this particular way? And I do think that the field in general is trying to kind of push past that and say at the bottom line, that question is not important. It is manifesting in this way, and like we need to understand what's going on, but it does not overlap entirely with any other diagnosis. So you see a really stark difference in scores on like SRCD kids and dyslexia kids, but you see partial overlap with children with DLD, children with SLI, those kinds of things, but not full overlap.
Thank you.
I don't see any more questions from students, so we'll open up to faculty. Any faculty have any questions for Kelly, feel free to chime in, as well as students if they have any more.
Hi, this is Maria. I have a question. That was a really nice talk, Kelly. I'm still having trouble extracting everything I think you want us to extract from this comparison. Is there a reason that the y-axes are on different scales?
Simply because the variation was broader. So I definitely could have adjusted the scales. And to be honest, if I would have looked more closely, I would have done that. But there was simply more data points and more variability in the scores. So it just kind of, that's how R decided to graph it. But I think it does kind of harken to Kaya's question in many ways of like, what's really going on with some of these kids, that the residual might be, you know, kind of in that negative space, and yet we don't exactly know what's going on with the relationships between their reading comprehension and their word reading ability.
I have a follow-up also that Kaya's comment triggered, which is the way you think about whether a kid with a really high, or, you know, whatever age appropriate reading comprehension score who shows up in this group according to your SRCD classification might be influenced by what the goal of your classification is. Are you trying to find the kids who are really out there? Or are you trying to find the kids who aren't reaching their potential?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think part of this is really tied into the fact that there's not a lot of brain-based literature in this group, which makes it really difficult, because I think that you realistically could test either of those, but that they are separable questions. The brain-based literature has basically all used the deficit model approach, which I find much more conservative. And I think really it's addressing, Marie, your first question of those who are really, really struggling. The regression model is much newer. The only published paper that uses it is one of Kaylee Reihart's papers, so someone out of my own lab. But it does seem to be getting much more at this question of reaching an individual's potential versus struggling with something like comprehension on a kind of more general, what we might consider an educationally relevant kind of way.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I see that you have your hand up. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, Kelly. Very nice talk. This was really, really great. And I thought Kaya asked a really good question. I actually had a similar question on the statistical side of what this would mean with the regression model. But I actually also was interested on maybe a slightly more conceptual side of like what the regression model means about what it means to have a reading comprehension deficit when you take out all of those predictor variables like vocabulary, and I missed some of the other ones, but if you could say a little bit more about what you think the residuals mean in the sense of like what comprehension is and what you're trying to get at. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question for me. I came into grad school thinking I was going to study the default mode network. And in many ways, I think that the regression model leads to those questions in a really interesting way, because when you take out, so this is the full model, when you take out word reading, vocabulary, your potential ADHD diagnosis or another diagnosis, your IQ score, and the interactions of all of those, you're left with something that almost feels like it might be outside of language entirely. Something that is the kind of way that we read and maybe construct visualizations, or you at least can imagine being in a space where your language ability is really fairly well controlled for, and the residual, or what's left, is kind of the other stuff that makes reading a fun activity versus something that we just have to do. I don't know that I would go as far as to claim that that's what's actually happening. I think that in the kind of classic view of this regression approach, the idea is that these subskills sometimes predict reading really, really well, and sometimes don't predict it well at all. And what we're interested in is just trying to see the cases in which word reading and vocab, all of these things, don't predict reading ability well, and try to understand what's happening between the comprehension and all the other stuff, what's kind of breaking in that path between the two. But I do think that on a conceptual level, this maybe also speaks to the fact that comprehension is much more complex than something like word reading, and that when you test something like comprehension, even with a standardized test, you're getting a lot of other stuff in that score, whether that be attention, whether it be your interest in the passage, whether it be, you know, if that was right after lunch and you're happy and your tummy's full and you're 7 and life is good, or like you're 15 and you don't want to be here, but your mom made you, you are getting a lot of stuff. And the 45-second pseudo word reading tower might not be capturing as much of that kind of outside stuff as a longer and more involved subtest like comprehension. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but.
It does. It's an interesting answer, and yeah, look forward to hearing about it in the future, more in the future. Thanks.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Hi, Kelly. Thanks for a great talk. I know we just have a few minutes left, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about your decision to pre-register and maybe what went well, maybe why you went that route, what went well, maybe what some challenges you might have faced and how you overcame them, and then maybe thinking ahead. Do you think, you know, in the long run, it's going to save you some time, or was it really this extra step to an already hard research process?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. I felt very drawn to pre-register for many reasons. One being that I think that it helps me to stay on track. Like many scientists, I think that, you know, you look at the data and a million things come to mind that you could do with that data. And I'm definitely there, right? But those million things need to be like one thing for this project. And so I think that if for no other reason, pre-registering really helps me to just stay on track with a particular project. But also, given the lack of literature on this particular deficit, I felt really drawn to pre-register to make it extremely clear to readers exactly what we were doing so that they could hopefully replicate in other samples. I feel very lucky to have access to a giant data set that is really kind of ripe for this kind of comparison, but I want to be able to share code and share the kind of conceptual work that went into this project in the hopes that other people will also be interested in doing something similar. The struggles really came from the fact that this is an open source data set, and it's a data set that my lab works with a lot. So we have done multiple projects. I have been a part of multiple projects on this data set. All of those projects previous to this one have been on dyslexia, but they're all reading based. And so I had a pretty good idea of what some of these measures would look like. I had a pretty good idea of the number of kids that we typically classify as having dyslexia in this sample. I did run some statistics before pre-registering to be sure that we could properly power an analysis if I went with the deficit model, because that, perhaps unsurprisingly, is one struggle of this field, is that everything's underpowered. But I think that in the long run, it was not really extra work. A lot of it's copy and pasted out of my master's proposal. And I think that it will really help, hopefully, to kind of drive the SRCD literature forward in making it a place where we can, you know, really focus on replication and trying to understand better what some of these questions look like across different samples.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions for Kelly, and thank you, Kelly, overall for your presentation. And we'll see everyone next week.